The sun was beating down mercilessly on the Arizona desert that July afternoon. The heat was so intense that the asphalt seemed to shimmer like water, and the air itself felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Interstate 40 stretched endlessly, in both directions, with nothing but cacti and red rock formations as far as the eye could see. It was the kind of day when smart people stayed indoors, with their air conditioning cranked up. But the Desert Hawks Motorcycle Club wasn't known for making smart decisions. They had been riding for 3 straight hours, and their leather jackets were starting to feel like portable ovens. The gas station appeared like a mirage in the distance. It wasn't much to look at, just a small building with a few pumps, surrounded by a gravel parking lot that had seen better days. A faded sign read "Last Chance Gas" in peeling letters, which seemed fitting for a place that sat in the middle of nowhere. Tank Morrison gunned his Harley as he led his crew into the parking lot. The roar of 12 motorcycles shattered the desert silence, sending a few startled birds flying from their perch on the gas station's roof. Tank was a big man, the kind of guy who took up space even when he wasn't trying to. His arms were covered in tattoos that told the story of a life lived on the edge, and his gray beard was braided with small silver rings that caught the sunlight. Behind him rode his loyal crew. There was Crusher, whose nickname came from his habit of settling disputes with his fists. Mad Dog earned his name from the wild look in his eyes whenever trouble started brewing. The rest of the crew followed their lead, each one trying to look tougher than the last. They pulled up to the gas pumps in a formation that blocked most of the available space. This wasn't an accident. It was a statement. The Desert Hawks had been riding together for over a decade, and they had developed certain habits. One of those habits was making sure everyone knew they were the toughest guys in any room they entered. The gas station attendant, a nervous young man named Pete, watched through the window as the bikers dismounted. He had worked at Last Chance Gas for 2 years, and he had seen all kinds of travelers pass through. Truckers, families on vacation, salesmen in rental cars, but motorcycle clubs always made him uneasy. Tank strutted toward the convenience store, his boots making deliberate sounds on the gravel. The spurs on his boots jingled with each step, adding to the intimidating effect. His crew followed behind him like a pack of wolves, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of trouble or opportunity. Inside the store, the air conditioning was a welcome relief from the desert heat. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the aisles of snacks and drinks. The place smelled like old coffee and cleaning supplies, with a hint of motor oil from the automotive section. That's when Tank noticed them. 3 young men stood near the back of the store, quietly selecting items from the cooler. They looked ordinary enough, just regular guys in their 20s wearing simple clothes. One had on a plain blue t-shirt and jeans. Another wore a gray tank top that showed off arms that were clearly no stranger to physical work. The third was smaller than his companions, wearing a black polo shirt and khaki shorts, but something about them caught Tank's attention. Maybe it was the way they carried themselves, or how they seemed to be aware of everything happening around them without actually looking. There was a quality to their posture that Tank recognized but couldn't quite place. The 3 men were clearly traveling together, but they didn't talk much. Communicated with small gestures and glances, the kind of wordless communication. That comes from spending a lot of time together in situations where silence is important. The one in the blue t-shirt appeared to be the leader of their small group. He was Hispanic, probably in his late 20s, with short black hair and intelligent brown eyes. He moved with confidence but without arrogance. The kind of person who was comfortable in his own skin. His companion in the gray tank top was built like a linebacker, with broad shoulders and thick arms. Despite his size, he moved quietly, almost gracefully. His red hair was cut short, and his green eyes missed nothing as he scanned the store. The third member of their group was Asian American. Smaller than his friends, but with a wiry strength that was obvious even under his casual clothes. He had an easy smile and seemed to be the one who kept the mood light among the 3. Tank watched them for a moment, trying to figure out what was bothering him about these guys. They looked like college students, maybe graduate students, taking a road trip. But there was something else. something that made his old instincts start tingling. You see? Tank had served in the military himself, many years ago. It hadn't ended well, a dishonorable discharge that still burned in his gut whenever he thought about it. He had been young and angry then, unable to handle the discipline and structure that military life demanded. The discharge had followed him for years, making it hard to find decent work and contributing to the bitterness that eventually led him to the motorcycle club. But those years in the service had taught him to recognize certain things. The way these three men stood, the way they moved, the constant awareness of their surroundings, it all pointed to military training. And that realization made Tank's jaw clench with old anger. The three soldiers, though, Tank didn't know their specific ranks or units were indeed military. They were on leave, driving cross-country to visit family in California. They had been looking forward to this break for months, eager to get away from the intensity of their training and deployment schedule. The soldier in the blue shirt was a staff sergeant, a leader who had earned his stripes through competence and dedication. He had joined the Army right out of high school and had never regretted the decision. The military had given him purpose, structure, and a brotherhood that meant everything to him. His larger companion was a corporal, a man who had found his calling. In the military, after a few years of drifting after college, he had been a college football player, but an injury had ended those dreams. The Army had given him a new way to channel his competitive nature and physical abilities. The smallest of the three was a private first class, the youngest of the group, but already showing the promise that would eventually make him a leader. He had immigrant parents who had worked multiple jobs to give him opportunities, and he carried their work ethic and determination with him everywhere he went. They had been driving for most of the day, taking turns behind the wheel of the staff sergeant's pickup truck. The truck was nothing fancy, just a reliable vehicle that could handle long distances and rough roads. It was loaded with their personal gear and gifts they were bringing home to family members. None of them were looking for trouble.
They were
trained for combat, yes, but they were also trained in discipline and restraint. Their instructors had taught them that real strength came from knowing when not to fight, not from looking for opportunities to prove how tough they were. But as Tank continued to stare at them, his resentment building with each passing second, the three soldiers began to sense that their peaceful stop for snacks and cold drinks might not go as smoothly as they had hoped. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everyone's afternoon in ways none of them could have predicted. Tank made his decision. He wasn't going to let these three walk out of here without knowing who ran this place. In his mind, respect was something you took, not something you earned. And these clean-cut boys in their nice clothes needed to learn that lesson. He nodded to Crusher and Mad Dog, a silent signal that had been used countless times before. The two bikers flanked him as he changed direction, moving away from the drink cooler and heading straight toward the three soldiers. The rest of the Desert Hawks spread out through the store, not quite surrounding the soldiers, but making it clear that this wasn't going to be a fair fight. Things went south. The staff sergeant noticed the movement first. His peripheral vision caught Tank's approach, and something in the biker's body language made him tense up slightly. Years of training had taught him to read situations quickly, and this one was heading in a bad direction. He made eye contact with his two companions. A brief glance that communicated volumes. The corporal shifted his weight slightly, moving into a better position. The private first class casually set down the energy drink he had been examining and turned to face the approaching bikers. To anyone watching, it might have looked like three friends just turning to see who was walking their way. But there was something else happening, something that Tank's untrained eye completely missed. These weren't college kids getting nervous about some tough-looking bikers. These were soldiers assessing a potential threat and preparing to respond. Tank stopped about 3 feet away from the staff sergeant, close enough to make the encounter feel threatening, but not so close that it would immediately turn physical. Crusher and Mad Dog positioned themselves on either side, creating a wall of leather and attitude. Well, Tank said, his voice carrying that particular tone that bullies use when they smell weakness. Look what we got here, boys. Couple of pretty boys out for a Sunday drive. The staff sergeant kept his expression neutral, but his mind was already running through possibilities. could see the other bikers moving around the store. You could feel the tension building in the air, like static electricity before a thunderstorm. His training told him to try to de-escalate, but his experience told him that might not be possible. Just passing through, he said calmly, his voice steady and respectful. Don't want any trouble. That was exactly the wrong thing to say. Tanks. Face twisted into an ugly grin. In his world, trying to avoid conflict meant you were weak. It meant you were scared. And scared people deserved whatever happened to them. Trouble? Tank repeated, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. Who said anything about trouble? We're just being friendly here, right, boys? Crusher cracked his knuckles. A sound, like small bones breaking. Mad Dog let out a low chuckle that had no humor in it at all. The other bikers moved closer, forming a loose semicircle around the three soldiers. Pete, the gas station attendant, had already reached for his phone. His hands were shaking as he dialed 911, but he kept his voice low as he spoke to the dispatcher. We got a situation here at Last Chance Gas on I-40. Looks like it's about to get ugly. Send someone quick. The dispatcher's voice was calm and... Professional units are en route. Stay on the line and keep away from the confrontation. But the nearest sheriff's deputy was still 25 minutes away. Pete had a sinking feeling that whatever was about to happen would be over long before help arrived, back by the coolers. Tank was just getting warmed up. He had performed this routine dozens of times before, and it always played out the same way. He would push and prod until the other guy either backed down completely or threw the first punch. Either way, Tank won. Either he got to feel superior to someone who was too scared to fight, or he got to beat someone up while claiming self-defense. You boys look like military, Tank continued, circling slowly around the staff sergeant like a shark smelling blood. Got that clean-cut government look about you? Let me guess, weekend warriors? National Guard, maybe? The corporal's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond. The private first class kept his breathing steady, using techniques he had learned to stay calm under pressure. The staff sergeant continued to track Tank's movement, noting how the biker was trying to get behind him, trying to make him feel surrounded and vulnerable. I asked you a question, soldier boy, Tank said, his voice getting harder.
Ow.
When someone talks to you, you show some respect. We're just trying to buy some drinks and get back on the road, the staff sergeant replied. Still keeping his tone even? We don't want any problems with you or your friends. Tank stopped circling and moved closer. Close enough that the staff sergeant could smell the combination of leather, sweat, and motor oil that seemed to cling to all the bikers. Close enough to be deliberately intimidating problems.
Thanks.
Voice rose. You think I'm a problem? You think we're problems? The other bikers started muttering among themselves, feeding off their leader's energy. This was how it always started. Tank would work himself up, and the rest of them would follow his lead. It was packed behavior, primitive and predictable. I spent 2 years getting pushed around by government types like you, Tank continued, his old anger bubbling to the surface. 2 years of being told what to do, when to do it, how to do it. You know where that got me? Kicked out with nothing. It's nothing but a piece of paper that made sure no decent employer would ever hire me. The staff sergeant began to understand what this was really about. This wasn't just random bullying. This was personal. Tank had issues with the military, and they were just unlucky enough to be wearing the wrong face at the wrong time. I'm sorry that happened to you, the staff sergeant said, and he genuinely meant it. He had seen good soldiers get discharged, for various reasons, and he knew how hard it could be to rebuild a life afterward. But Tank interpreted the sympathy as condescension, and it only made him angrier. Sorry, he snarled. You think sorry fixes anything? You think your pretty words make up for years of getting treated like garbage? He stepped even closer, and now there was no mistaking his intent. This was going to turn physical, and soon. It's time someone taught you government boys what it feels like to get pushed around, Tank said, his fists clenching at his sides. The corporal shifted his weight, ready to move if necessary. The private first class took a small step back, creating more room to maneuver. Both movements were subtle, but they didn't go unnoticed by the staff sergeant, who felt a surge of confidence knowing his men were ready. Around the store, the other bikers were getting restless. They could sense that their leader was building up to something, and they wanted to be ready when it happened. Crusher was flexing his massive hands, imagining how good it would feel to use them. Mad Dog was practically bouncing on his toes, his eyes wild with anticipation. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Pete continued to whisper urgently into his phone, begging the dispatcher to hurry. The three soldiers remained calm on the surface, but underneath, they were preparing for what they all knew was coming. Tank took one more step forward. Close enough now that his chest was almost touching the staff sergeant's. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper that somehow carried more threat than all his previous shouting. Right, time for you boys to learn some respect. And with that, he drew back his fists and threw the punch that would change everything. Tank's fist came flying through the air like a sledgehammer. Put all his weight behind it, all his anger, all his years of resentment. In his mind, this punch was going to drop the smart-mouthed soldier boy and show everyone in the store who was really in charge. But the punch never landed. What happened next took place so fast that most people in the store couldn't even process it. 1 second, Tank was throwing what looked like a fight-ending haymaker, and the next second, he was stumbling forward into empty air. Completely off balance, the staff sergeant had moved like liquid mercury. He didn't step back or try to block the punch like most people would have. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly to the left, turning his body just enough to let Tank's fist whistle past his ear. At the same time, he reached out and grabbed Tank's extended wrist with both hands. What came next was pure physics, mixed with years of hand-to-hand combat training. The staff sergeant used Tank's own momentum against him, pulling the biker forward while simultaneously stepping to the side. Tank, who had expected to hit solid resistance, found himself flying through the space, where his target had been just a split second before. The big biker crashed into a display of motor oil with a sound like thunder. Plastic bottles went flying everywhere, bouncing off shelves and rolling across the floor. Tank hit the metal display rack hard enough to dent it, and the impact drove all the air from his lungs in a whoosh that everyone in the store could hear. For a moment, there was complete silence. The other bikers stood frozen, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Their fearless leader, the man who had never lost a fight in all the years they had known him, was sitting on the floor surrounded by motor oil bottles, looking dazed and confused, but the staff sergeant wasn't done. As Tank struggled to get back to his feet, the soldier's entire demeanor changed. The polite, respectful young man who had been trying to avoid trouble was gone. In his place stood someone completely different, someone dangerous. His posture shifted in a way that was almost impossible to describe. He seemed to grow taller without actually changing height. His shoulders squared, his chin came up slightly, and his eyes took on a cold, calculating look that made several of the bikers instinctively step backward. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried through the store like a whisper in a library. "I told you we didn't want any trouble." Tank finally made it back to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and rage. He had motor oil on his jacket, and his hair was messed up, but more than that, his reputation had just taken a serious hit in front of his entire crew. "You got lucky," he snarled, wiping oil from his hands. "That was just a lucky move." The staff sergeant didn't respond, simply stood there, perfectly balanced, perfectly calm, waiting to see what would happen next. That's when Crusher decided to get involved. The big biker had been watching from the sidelines, and he couldn't believe what he had just seen. Tank was tough, but Crusher was tougher. At least that's what he had always believed. He was bigger than Tank, stronger than Tank, and meaner than Tank. If his leader couldn't handle one skinny soldier boy, then Crusher would show everyone how it was done. He pulled a tire iron from his jacket, a heavy piece of metal that he had carried for years. The weight of it in his hand made him feel confident again. Let's see the pretty boy dodge this. But as Crusher raised the tire iron above his head, the corporal moved. The red-haired soldier had been watching Crusher from the moment the confrontation started. He had seen the way the big biker's hand kept moving toward his jacket, and he had been ready when the weapon appeared. The corporal covered the distance between them in 3 quick steps. His left hand shot out and grabbed Crusher's wrist, stopping the tire iron mid-swing. His right hand formed a fist and drove upward into Crusher's solar plexus. A precise strike that hit just below the ribcage. Crusher's eyes went wide as all the air left his body. The tire iron clattered to the floor as his hands flew to his stomach. He doubled over, gasping like a fish out of water, completely unable to catch his breath. The corporal stepped back, watching to make sure Crusher wasn't going to be a problem anymore. The big biker was still trying to breathe, making horrible wheezing sounds as he struggled to get air into his lungs. At the same time, Mad Dog was discovering that the smallest of the three soldiers was not the easy target he appeared to be. Mad Dog had circled around behind the private first class, thinking he could grab the young soldier and use him as a hostage or human shield. It seemed like a smart plan, to take out the weakest member of the group and force the other two to surrender. But as Mad Dog reached out to grab the private first class from behind, the young soldier seemed to sense him coming. Without even turning around, he dropped low and swept his leg backward in a wide arc. Mad Dog's feet went out from under him so fast that he had no time to break his fall. He hit the floor hard, landing flat on his back with a thud that shook the entire building. The impact stunned him, and he lay there for a moment, staring up at the fluorescent lights and wondering what had just happened. The private first class turned around and looked down at Mad Dog with something that might have been pity. "Stay down," he said quietly. "Please." It was the please that really got to Mad Dog. Here was this kid, it's probably 10 years younger than him, asking politely for him to stay on the ground after just dropping him like a sack of potatoes. The humiliation was almost worse than the physical. Pete, the gas station attendant, was still on the phone with the 911 dispatcher, but now he was whispering in amazement rather than fear. "You're not going to believe this," he said into the phone. "These three guys just took apart an entire motorcycle gang. It was like watching a movie or something." The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone. "Sir, are you saying the situation is under control?" Pete looked around the store. Tank was back on his feet but keeping his distance, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Crusher was still trying to catch his breath, leaning against a shelf for support. Mad Dog was sitting on the floor, apparently deciding that staying down was indeed the smart choice. The other bikers were backing away, their tough guy attitudes evaporating like water in the desert heat. They had signed up to intimidate ordinary people, not to fight trained soldiers who could make them look like amateurs. "Yeah," Pete said into the phone, still hardly believing it himself. "But I think it's under control." The three soldiers regrouped near the center of the store, positioning themselves so they could watch all the remaining bikers at once. They weren't showing off or gloating. They were just calmly, professionally, making sure the threat was neutralized. The staff sergeant looked around at the scattered bikers, then back at Tank. When he spoke, his voice was still quiet, but now everyone in the store was listening. "We tried to do this the easy way," he said, "but you wouldn't let us. Now here's how this is going to work." The staff sergeant's words hung in the air like a challenge. The remaining bikers looked at each other nervously, unsure of what to do next. Their three toughest members were either on the ground or backing away, and these soldiers didn't even look winded. Tank wiped motor oil from his beard, his pride stinging worse than any physical pain. He had built his reputation on being the meanest, toughest guy in any room. That reputation was crumbling in front of his entire crew. Tank hadn't survived this long by giving up easily. "This ain't over," he growled, trying to salvage some dignity. "Think you're tough because you caught us off guard? Let's see how tough you are when we're ready for you," he signaled to his remaining crew members. There were still 8 bikers who hadn't been directly involved in the fight yet. They spread out through the store, moving slowly and deliberately. If they couldn't intimidate these soldiers, maybe they could overwhelm them with sheer numbers. But the 3 soldiers had been watching this happen, and they were ready. The corporal moved first. He had spotted 2 bikers trying to flank them. From the left side of the store, near the automotive section, these weren't the biggest or meanest of the remaining crew, but they were carrying chains they had pulled from their bikes outside. The first biker swung his chain in a wide arc, aiming for the corporal's head. But the soldier ducked under the swing and stepped inside the biker's reach, grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it sharply, forcing him to drop the chain. Then he used a simple hip throw that sent the biker tumbling into a display of windshield wiper fluid. The second biker tried to rush him while he was distracted. But the corporal was ready. He sidestepped the charge and stuck out his foot, sending the biker sprawling across the floor. The man slid face first into a rack of candy bars, sending chocolate and gum flying everywhere on the other side of the store. The private first class was dealing with his own problems. 3 bikers had cornered him near the slush machine, thinking they could gang up on the smallest soldier. They couldn't have been more wrong. The private first class moved like he was dancing. When the first biker threw a punch, he slipped too. The side and the fist hit nothing but air. The second biker tried to grab him from behind. But the soldier spun away, and the biker's arms closed on empty space. The third biker pulled out a knife, thinking that would even the odds. But as he lunged forward, the private first class caught his wrist and used the biker's own momentum to send him crashing into the slush machine. Red and blue slush exploded everywhere, covering all 3 bikers in sticky syrup. The biker with the knife found himself flat on his back in a puddle of cherry slush, wondering how a kid half his size had just thrown him around like a rag doll. The knife was nowhere to be found, probably buried somewhere under the mess of ice and syrup. Meanwhile, the staff sergeant was handling Tank and the remaining 3 bikers near the front of the store. Tank had found a baseball bat from behind the counter and was swinging it like he was trying to hit a home run. But every swing missed by inches as the staff sergeant moved with fluid grace. It's never seeming hurried, but never getting hit. One of Tank's remaining supporters tried to tackle the staff sergeant from the side, but the soldier saw him coming. He stepped back, grabbed the charging biker by the shirt, and used his momentum to send him sliding across the slick floor where motor oil from the earlier crash had spread. The biker slid like he was on ice, his arms windmilling wildly as he tried to keep his balance. He crashed into a display of air fresheners, sending dozens of little pine trees flying through the air. Another biker tried to be smart and grabbed a mop from the janitor's closet, thinking he could use the long handle to keep the soldiers at a distance. But the corporal had finished with his opponents and came to help his sergeant. The corporal grabbed the mop handle and pulled, yanking the surprised biker forward. Then he pushed the handle back, catching the man in the stomach and doubling him over. A gentle push sent the gasping biker stumbling backward into the bathroom door, which swung open and deposited him in a heap on the tile floor. Tank was getting desperate now. His bat wasn't working. His crew was scattered around the store like broken toys, and these 3 soldiers still looked like they were just getting warmed up. He decided to try one last desperate move. He feinted with the bat, then dropped it and tried to tackle the staff sergeant around the waist. It was a move that had worked for him in bar fights before. Use his weight and size to drive his opponent to the ground where he could use his fists. But the staff sergeant had been expecting this. As Tank dove forward, the soldier stepped aside and grabbed the biker's belt. Using Tank's own momentum and gravity, guided the big man face first into a stack of motor oil cases that hadn't been knocked over in the earlier crash. Tank hit the cardboard boxes. It's hard enough to collapse the entire stack. He disappeared under an avalanche of motor oil bottles, his legs sticking out like something from a cartoon. When he finally struggled free, he was covered in oil from head to toe and had lost all fight left in him. The last standing biker, eh? Skinny guy with more tattoos than sense looked around at his fallen comrades and made the smartest decision of his life. He raised his hands high in the air. "I give up," he said quickly. "I don't want any part of this." The private first class nodded approvingly. Smart choice. Pete, the gas station attendant, had been watching the entire thing with his mouth hanging open. He was still holding the phone, and the 911 dispatcher was asking for updates. "Ma'am," Pete said into the phone, "you're really not going to believe this. Those 3 guys just took apart the entire motorcycle gang. It was like watching ninjas or something. Nobody got seriously hurt, but there's motor oil and slush everywhere, and I think one guy is stuck in my bathroom." The dispatcher sounded skeptical. "Sir, did you say 3 men defeated 12 bikers?" "I saw it with my own eyes," Pete replied. "These weren't just regular guys. These were like professional fighters or something. Military, I think. They moved like they'd done this kind of thing before, around the store. The scene looked like a tornado had hit it. Bikers were scattered everywhere, some sitting on the floor looking dazed, others leaning against walls trying to catch their breath. Motor oil, slush, and various snack foods were scattered across the floor, but remarkably, nobody was seriously injured. The soldiers had used just enough force to neutralize the threats without causing permanent damage. It was precision violence, controlled and professional. The three soldiers regrouped in the center of the store, standing calmly while they surveyed the aftermath. They weren't celebrating or showing off. They were just doing a job, the same way. They might clear a building or secure a perimeter overseas. Tank finally pulled himself fully out of the motor oil boxes. His leather jacket was ruined, his pride was shattered, and he had the worst headache of his life. But as he looked at the three soldiers standing there so calmly, he began to understand exactly who he had tried to mess with. These weren't weekend warriors or desk soldiers. These were the real deal. The sound of sirens began echoing across the desert, growing louder with each passing second. Sheriff's deputies were finally arriving. Though they were about to find a situation unlike anything they had trained for, Tank sat on the floor, still, dripping with motor oil, staring at the three soldiers who had just dismantled his entire crew. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. In all his years of bar fights, street brawls, and motorcycle club conflicts, he had never seen anything like this. These weren't lucky college kids who had gotten in a few good shots. These were professionals. The way they moved, the way they stayed calm under pressure, the precision of every technique they used, it all pointed to one conclusion that Tank was finally starting to accept. The staff sergeant walked over to where Tank was sitting and extended his hand. Not to help him up, but to offer something else entirely. "No hard feelings," the soldier said quietly. "You started this, but it's over now." Tank looked at the offered hand for a long moment. His pride was screaming at him to refuse, to make some final gesture of defiance. But something in the soldier's eyes stopped him. There was no mockery there, no gloating, just a professional doing his job. Slowly, Tank reached up and shook the soldier's hand. "What are you guys?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Special Forces? Rangers." The staff sergeant helped Tank to his feet. "Just soldiers," he replied. "But we've been doing this for a while." The corporal was moving through the store, checking on the various bikers scattered around. Most of them were sitting up now, looking embarrassed rather than angry. The fight had gone out of them completely. When someone beats you that thoroughly without even breathing hard, it changes your perspective on a lot of things. Crusher was leaning against a shelf, finally able to breathe normally again. He caught the corporal's eye and nodded respectfully. "You know what you're doing," he admitted. "I'll give you that." The corporal nodded back. "You took it better than most. Respect for that." Mad Dog was still sitting in the puddle of slush, picking pieces of ice out of his hair. The private first class walked over and offered him a towel from behind the counter. "Sorry about the mess," the young soldier said with a slight smile. "Cherry slush is pretty sticky." Mad Dog took the towel and actually laughed. "Kid, I've been in a lot of fights in my life, but I've never been thrown into a slush machine before. That's a new one." The first sheriff's deputy came through the door with his hand on his weapon, expecting to find chaos and violence. Instead, he found three young men in civilian clothes standing calmly in the middle of a very messy convenience store, surrounded by a motorcycle gang that looked like they had just been through a washing machine. "What's the situation here?" the deputy asked, his eyes scanning the scene in confusion. The staff sergeant stepped forward, his hands visible and his posture relaxed. "Deputy, I'm Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, United States Army. These are my men. Corporal Williams and Private First Class Chen. We were purchasing supplies when this group approached us aggressively. The situation escalated to physical violence, but it's been resolved." The deputy looked around the store again, taking in the motor oil everywhere, the collapsed displays, the slush covering half the floor. Then he looked at the 12 bikers, all of whom seemed remarkably subdued for a motorcycle gang. "Let me get this straight," the deputy said slowly. "You three did all this?" "They started it," Tank said from behind the deputy. The sheriff turned to look at the big biker, surprised to hear him defending the soldiers. "We came at them looking for trouble, and they gave us more than we bargained for." Pete, the gas station attendant, finally hung up his phone and approached the deputy. "Officer, I saw the whole thing. These bikers were trying to intimidate these three guys, and it backfired spectacularly. I've got it all on the security cameras if you want to see." The deputy nodded and looked back at the staff sergeant. "I'm going to need to see some identification and get statements from everyone involved." As the soldiers produced their military IDs, the deputy's expression changed. He recognized the unit designation on the staff sergeant's card. These weren't just regular Army soldiers. They were part of an elite unit that the sheriff's department had worked with on training exercises. "Gentlemen," the deputy said with new respect in his voice, "I think we can handle this pretty quickly." Over the next hour, statements were taken and the security footage was reviewed. The cameras had captured everything, from Tank's initial aggression to the final moment when the last biker surrendered. It was clear who had started the confrontation and who had been defending themselves. But something interesting happened during those interviews. As each biker told his version of events, a pattern emerged. None of them were angry at the soldiers anymore. If anything, they seemed impressed. "Those guys could have hurt us bad," Crusher told the deputy. "But they didn't. They just did what they had to do to stop the fight." Mad Dog nodded in agreement. "I've been in a lot of scraps, officer. Usually when someone beats you, they want to rub your face in it. These guys were different. Professional, you know. Even Tank, when it came his turn to give his statement, was honest about what had happened. I started it," he admitted. "I was looking for trouble and I found it. But these soldiers, they handled it right. Could have been a lot worse for us." The deputy was amazed. In his 15 years of law enforcement, he had never seen the aftermath of a fight where the losers were defending the winners. As the interviews concluded, it became clear that no charges would be filed. The security footage showed self-defense, and the bikers themselves were admitting they had been the aggressors. More importantly, nobody had been seriously injured, despite the dramatic nature of the confrontation. The bikers were given warnings about disturbing the peace and sent on their way. As they filed out of the store, several of them stopped to shake hands with the soldiers. "Thanks for not making it worse than it had to be," one of them said. Tank was the last to leave. He approached the staff sergeant one final time, extending his hand again. "I learned something today," he said. "Being tough isn't about picking fights with people. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. You guys could have walked away, but you couldn't because I wouldn't let you. When you had to fight, you did it right." The staff sergeant shook his hand firmly. "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do afterward." Tank nodded and walked toward the door. Just before he left, he turned back one more time. "For what it's worth," he said, "thank you for your service." After the bikers left and the deputies finished their paperwork, the store fell quiet again. Pete was already starting to clean up the mess, shaking his head in amazement at what he had witnessed. The three soldiers gathered their original purchases, energy drinks, and snacks that had somehow survived the chaos and headed for the checkout counter. "Sorry about the mess," the staff sergeant said to Pete. Pete waved him off. "Are you kidding? This is the most exciting thing that's happened here in 2 years. Plus, those security cameras are going to make one heck of a training video for the sheriff's department." As they walked back to their truck, the corporal looked at his companions and grinned. "It's so much for a quiet road trip." The private first class laughed. "At least we got our snacks." The staff sergeant started the truck and pulled back onto the empty highway. In the rearview mirror, he could see the Desert Hawks mounting their motorcycles, their earlier swagger completely gone. It had been an unexpected detour, but sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected places. For the bikers, it was a lesson about respect and recognizing real strength when you see it. For the soldiers, it was a reminder that their training stayed with them even when they were just trying to buy a cold drink on a hot day. The desert highway stretched ahead. 3 soldiers continued their journey home, leaving behind a gas station full of people who would never forget the day they learned the difference between looking tough and being dangerous.